All right, so I am Vanessa Anastasopoulos. I'm the chair of the Independent Consulting Community of Interest, or ICCI, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on ethical AI use in independent consulting. We are joined today from people across Turtle Island, and I'm paying respect to all Indigenous peoples in this region and across Canada. I'm joining from Tiohtià:ke, known by some as Montreal, on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. And I'm inviting all of you who feel like it, to share in the chat where you are joining from today. Our session is being recorded so that it will be available for viewing on the CES website and the ICCI's YouTube page. And the Q&A, though, apologies, will not be shared as a recording. And our webinar today is being hosted on CES's Zoom account, so we're very grateful for that technical support. And as is becoming habitual now, thankfully, Riley from CES is here for the start of the session and will share information in the chat, or has already shared information in the chat, on how to turn on closed captioning, and importantly, how to turn on automatic French translation. Please feel free to communicate in French or English during this session. And if you run into any technical issues, feel free to message Riley directly. Also have a bit of good news to share. The ICCI's new website is finally up and running. Okay, we haven't officially sent out a launching email yet, but we are posting the link in the chat so that folks here today can get a sneak preview. And also, you will soon find an invitation in the chat, or, oh, it's already there, which is great, to introduce yourselves and to answer a few questions about your thoughts on AI. The last little announcement before we get going is that in February, we have an exciting panel presentation coming up, hosted again by the ICCI, on planning for retirement for independent consultants. So stay tuned for those details in your inbox. I'm going to share my screen. See if I can. There we go. I think, is it shared? No, not yet. Does everybody see that? Now I can't see you, so I
Yeah,
can't see. Yes, I'm
it's
okay. Thank you. All right. So let's get started with our main feature of the day. The ICCI is pleased to bring to you a panel presentation on strengthening ethical AI use in independent consulting, considerations for a professional, values-driven approach. Our panelists are Carolyn Hosler, Roman Kars-Nelson, and Ted Weaker, and I'm facilitating the discussion today. So I'll take this opportunity to point out that several of us have been or are currently volunteers on the ICCI's steering committee. Roman is currently serving as a member representative. Carolyn is past member representative, as well as election chair at our past two AGMs. And of course, I'm the ICCI chair. We hope that some of you will decide to join us on the steering committee at some point, hopefully in June at our next AGM. We also have other members of our steering committee joining us, including, I see just on my screen, Gail, who's our past chair, that we're very happy to have with us. Also, I'll mention that several of our speakers today were also speakers at the ICCI's very first inaugural webinar back in May 2024. So that includes Ted, Carolyn, and myself. At that time, that webinar was when most of us were still pretty new to AI. And so the topic was on navigating AI for independent consultants. And so in some ways, we can think of today's webinar as a 2-year follow-up on that. though today is much less of a how-to webinar and much more of a what to think about webinar. In terms of our agenda for the day, first, Carolyn will give us an overview of what generative AI really is, so that we're all starting the discussion on the same page. And then Ted is going to share with us some of the latest developments in AI that affect our work as independent consultants. I'll then speak briefly about the CES's ethics guide, excuse me, and how it can be used to inform our ethical reflections about using AI. And it's at that point, about 15 to 20 minutes from now, that we'll jump into the panel portion of our webinar. And our panelists are going to talk about how they approach thinking ethically about using AI in independent consulting. And I can tell you from now that they're going to be drawing on the CES's ethics guide to frame that discussion. We'll then dedicate the last portion of our session to answering your questions. But if you think of questions beforehand, please add them to the chat so that the panelists can address them when we get to the Q&A. And you can do so in English or French. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Carolyn to kick us off with a look at what AI is.
Hi, everyone. I'm looking forward to talking to you a bit about AI because I think if we better understand it, we can understand why it has the limitations it has and what are the possibilities. So I'm looking forward to going on to TED's, which also talks about why AI is changing. But in the meantime, I want to get us into what is this thing called generative AI. Generative AI is a thinking partner, a novice drafter, an idea generator. The key in that is generative. It's going to create new things, create interesting things. That could be text, images, Excel formulas, recommendations, step-by-step processes, former documents, even audio now. I don't know if anyone's seen the videos that AI creates, but it's almost like 90% there, or getting close to 90% there for lip reading as well. So it's really advancing quite rapidly. It's also good at summaries and synthesis if it understands the topic, and about presentations even. It can create a presentation based on an outline. We want to think about what it is and where it has its limitations and also its strengths. Like any tool, it's good at certain things, and it has different options for us to interact with it. One of the ways we interact is a text-based chat window that we often think of as ChatGPT. We think of it with Claude, with Gemini, some of the other formats, but it's also being embedded in pop-up windows and little kind of icons that are there to assist. If you've been around long enough to remember the old days of Word with a little paperclip with the "Can I help you?" It is now the new equivalent of that but the data doesn't stay in your computer. There's also custom AI with instructions on the back end, and there are people leading in this work, developing things like agents and chatbots and systems that help work for them. When we think about AI, one of the things that we want to think about is what's going on under this hood. If you're like me and you drive a car and you know that there's stuff under the hood, but you don't often go digging into it, this is the equivalent of opening that hood up. Underneath what happens when we type in those prompts that you can see here, we just type them into the computer and we're asking for something. Those instructions get mixed into the recipe. They get mixed into the large language module, which is all the algorithms it's been training itself on. And the thing with Gen AI is with little to no to some guidance, it trains itself. So it tries to understand the world correctly or incorrectly based on real things, based on biased things, all of it together. Then what it does is does predictive testing, going through millions of approximations as it learns. To get your answer, it depends on which type of software you use, but it will go through quite a few approximations to try to give you its best guess. It is approximating a best answer based on the internet. The data has the instructions and the content. If it doesn't understand your context, it will not give you an appropriate answer because it's approximating to the context that it knows. So by doing that, it allows us to understand why it may have some limitations. I use AI, and sometimes it's 100% on. Sometimes last night I did a comparison with human coded data where there's a lot of like inference, there's a lot of reading between the lines when someone says something because of what they mean. And what that means there in that reading between the lines is we just use different phrases a lot of the time to mean the same thing. In a sector where that happens a lot, the accuracy can be as low as 10%. In an area where we're all using the same language, the accuracy can be up to 90%. So just know that that contextual nature will change drastically how effective it is. When we think about it, again, AI is really good for AI, idea or option generation, summarizing and synthesis, layperson descriptions. I quite like sometimes putting in the public report kind of content that I'm about to put out live with just, okay, how do I want to make this so it's maybe accessible to a grade 10 audience, for example. We want to talk about norm aligned or typical output as well. So this is where the output in the context is going to be really well understood and it's very common or very similar or very familiar. When we think about the uses, again, there's all the ones we had on the page before, but in evaluation, I like to think of things like drafting theory of change based on documents. It may provide some survey questions or reflection questions or focus group questions. Create visuals. A lot of people use it for the visual of their on a proposal or on a report, for example, or infographic. You can get face validity checks. So I've often put my questions up and asked it, what do you think I'm getting at in these questions? I might give it some of the context and still ask, what do you get at? Want to improve maybe tone or formality. Transcription, quite excellent there now. Getting labeling in there a little bit better. Some translation like we're experiencing today. There'll be meeting minutes as well. So that's often done now with AI, and you can create case studies or examples. And you can also even put your website up and ask it to tell you about what it sees in your website and what it thinks you do. So there's many uses in those ways, but there's also concerns like hallucinations, fictional inaccurate, misrepresentations, the loss of our control when we put it into the system, and any risks of data breaches or reuse. Is it sustainable? That's a really big question mark that has some doubt at the moment, but also has some exciting changes. So speaking further to changes, Ted will now talk about how AI is changing.
Am I sharing? There we go. Just slow. So I'm Ted Weicker. I work with Catalyst Research Group. We use AI a lot in our work. I am absolutely fixated on AI. I think most of my friends would tell. I spend a lot of time looking at it and talking about it. I'm someone who spends a lot of time trying to understand what the impact of AI is going to be on the consulting industry, on evaluation, but also on how the tools are further developing. And so, first of all, maybe I'll refer you to a couple of documents that we've written about this. A little bit of a background in terms of this summer, we spent some time just trying to take a step back during a vacation and trying to understand what the impact of AI is going to be on the consulting industry and also how we can respond to it. So maybe I'll refer you to that. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go through it. But we wrote a series of articles, one around the threat of AI, kind of what changes it's going to make. Secondly, around a bit of a survival guide of how we as a firm, how you as independent consultants can respond maybe effectively to using AI. When I wrote the articles, I got a lot of questions around from evaluators, wondering whether, okay, it's going to impact consulting. Is it going to impact program evaluation? The general conclusion is it will. In fact, because program evaluation is so well structured, it's actually a little bit more easy to adopt AI into our practices, whether it's, as Carolyn mentioned, the theory of change or other elements of it. And my partner, Slavica Stevanovic, recently was on a podcast with Maria Montenegro talking about that. So that would be a way to get a little bit more information around the kind of background research we've done. So in terms of the key takeaway points is first of all, the capabilities of AI are changing dramatically. There was even something that came out this week, this Claude Co-work program, which is going to make some fundamental changes, but it's just this endless series of advances in the program, which are really impacting on the usability of the tool for us. When we look at the tools, we see it can already do a lot of the functions that we do. I think Carolyn gave a really nice kind of a summary of some of the different applications of it. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out how we can adopt it into our processes and struggling with some of the challenges around that. I think another observation is the industry by and large has been pretty slow to adopt. I think for the most part, we're casual users. We use it for very particular applications. We have questions or we're dealing with a particular issue. We'll use it, but we really haven't fully integrated into our processes. And that's something that's going to happen more and more over the next few years. I think other key points is that we're at the point now where clients are expecting us to use it. So I think for us, certainly in our practice, a big change was the federal government. When Carney came in, he made AI a priority within the federal government. And certainly from our clients' perspective, it's been just a absolute change in terms of how open they are to using AI and so on. And that'll filter through a lot of the evaluation functions. So some of the things that means is, first of all, the roles we play as consultants are going to evolve a bit. I'll leave it up to the documents maybe to give you a little bit of background on that, but certainly what we do and how we do it is going to be changing. Who we compete against is changing a bit. Where clients are now or much more able perhaps to do some of the things we've traditionally done, so that'll change things. We're also dealing with organizations that are using AI tools to a greater extent than in the past. And it's really become a competitive variable. So as Carolyn mentioned, one of the things we took a look at kind of going into this discussion is around some of the changes that have happened. The last time we spoke was back in May 2024. GPT 4.0 had just come out. And since then, it was kind of fun to take a step back and look at all the advances that have been made over the last, 18 or 20 months. So in terms of the further development of reasoning models, being able to, back prior to that, if you ask a question, a number of seconds, 6, 7 seconds later, it would start typing and give you the answer back. Now, it's not unusual for us to have prompts that may take 20 or 30 minutes before it's actually responding back on it. Contact windows are so much bigger than they were before. It's so much more coherent in that it'll remember these long conversations. Back in 2024, it would forget the interaction you had at the beginning of the conversation by the end of the conversation. We've seen multimodals. We've seen the development of mini models. It's now possible to get a fairly substantial language model on your desktop. I've got RAG databases which are developing, which are really, really useful in terms of being able to build on your knowledge base and kind of the work that you've done in the past. Tool accessibility, we can go out and send the large language model to other websites or to use a wide variety of different tools, which we couldn't before. And the hallucination rates are way down from where they were back in 3.5 and 4. So according to OpenAI, they're roughly around 5 or 6% now. It hallucinates a lot more than that, but it has a lot to do with the nature of the data that's going into it or the nature of the context. So at this point, maybe I'll just hand it back to Vanessa. But in terms of the last comment is really around the extent to which we're anticipating seeing significant advances over the next little while, whether it's around agents, whether it's around inference going on, whether it's around the development of vibe coding, all of these kind of things. And anyway, I'll hand it back to you, Vanessa. I assume I've gone over my time.
We're still okay. Thank you, Ted, for that. I will share my screen again. Okay, so I'm going to talk for a few minutes about CS's ethics guide because it's a useful tool for guiding all evaluators in making ethically sound decisions throughout our evaluation practice in every situation, including, of course, guiding ethically sound decisions about our use of AI. CS rolled out the current version of the ethics guide in 2023, and we're about to roll out a variety of supports for learning how to apply the ethics guide, notably including an Institute course that will be free for all CES members and mandatory for credentialed evaluators. For full disclosure, I said we are rolling out CS's ethics guidance tools because I've been on CS's ethics committee since 2017. So I'm going to paste now in the chat the ethics guide so that you can all, if I can find the chat, here we go, so that you can all read it if you have not done so already, but you can also follow the QR code on the slide. And essentially, what we're proposing, is that we should be making decisions about when and how we use AI in the same way that we should be making any other ethical decisions in evaluation practice. So that's by reflecting on how core professional values apply to specific contexts of the evaluation decision that we need to make. CES's ethics guide, which all CES members agree to abide by when we renew our memberships annually, gives us 3 core professional values to guide how we make decisions across all phases of an evaluation. So these are upholding the rights and well-being of persons, peoples, and all of nature, seeking honesty, truth, and transparency, and being responsible to all engaged in or affected by the evaluation work. The beauty of the guide is that it recognizes that ethics are only very rarely a question of right and wrong or black and white. And I say this because historically, evaluation ethics was approached deontologically, meaning that professional evaluation associations' ethics guides told their members, here's what you should always do, here's what you should never do. Now we know that ethics are usually a matter of shades of gray, and what might be ethically correct in one context is not necessarily correct in another. So I believe that CS is actually the first professional evaluation society's ethics guidance around the world to move away from a deontological approach and embrace a professional values-based approach. In addition to identifying 3 core professional values that guide how evaluators do evaluation, the ethics guide also gives us a process to help us think about how best to integrate our core values into all of the various decisions we make when we conduct evaluations across all phases of an evaluation from conception to use. All right, so now how can independent consultants apply this to our context-specific decisions about when and how to use AI? So let's start with what I think of as an easy example about the first core value, upholding rights and well-being. So this includes, among other things, respecting privacy and protecting participants from harm. And at this point in time, most of us probably already know that if I'm working on a fully de-identified data set or publicly available information, I can probably use AI more freely than if my data contains private or sensitive information that in the wrong hands might harm participants' well-being. Again, it depends on the type of program you're using, I guess. But this is an example of how evaluators can think about our first core professional value when making decisions about how to use AI. The second core value, seeking truth, honesty, and transparency, means that, among other things, I have the responsibility as an evaluator to check that the evidence is valid. So before using AI, I can ask, can I verify the accuracy of what it's producing? And some AI tools are still black boxes and you can't see how they generate outputs, though thankfully this is becoming less common. If I can't validate the process, I can't vouch for the results. That's problematic as an evaluator. There are other tools for which the line of evidence is easier to trace. So that's just a quick example of how applying the core values of truth, honesty, and transparency can help me ethically think about my AI use in terms of which apps I might use. And then the third core value is being responsible to others, and responsible practice includes, among other things, using resources wisely. So AI is often assumed to be a time saver, But honestly, for me, and depending on the task at hand, integrating AI thoughtfully into my evaluation work sometimes takes me more time, not less. And in these cases, I use AI because it improves the quality of my work. And as an independent consultant who often works alone, it's like having a team of intermediate level evaluators to bounce ideas off of. But if my time investment outweighs the benefit, AI may not be the most responsible choice for me, especially if my client's project timelines are tight. So, what all of this boils down to is that ethical AI use is not a one-size-fits-all decision. It depends on how our core values apply within a given context. And our panelists are going to be exploring all of this in much more detail because we've grouped the panel into three overarching discussion questions, each one based on one of the three core values. But before I turn it over to the panel, I'll talk very briefly about ethical dilemmas, which are what evaluators face when values conflict with one another. So sometimes it's one of our three core values that's clashing with another one. And that's the example I just gave, where my aim to produce higher quality work aligned with truth, honesty, and transparency can conflict with how much time AI use takes me, which relates to being responsible to others. So the tension creates an ethical dilemma, if you will. Should I use more of my client's project time to ensure even higher quality work, or should I prioritize efficient use of project resources? And there are often other types of values at play, not just our three core values, that can conflict with our three core values, such as the evaluation commissioner's values, those of the various interest holders, and even our own personal values. So we don't have time today to get into the reflective process proposed by CES's ethics guide to help us resolve ethical dilemmas in AI use. However, if it's accepted, I'll be presenting this at the CES National Conference in May with Tin Vo, who's also a member of the Ethics Committee. Our presentation title is going to be When to Use AI, Applying CES's Ethics Guide as a Tool for Making Ethical Choices. And we're exploring ethical dilemmas in more detail. So perhaps if you're at the conference, I will see you there. And with that, let's move on to the panel discussion portion of today's session. So for the next half hour, I'll be asking our panelists three questions, one for each of the three core professional values. And I'll start by first asking Carolyn and Ted, how do you approach using AI while upholding the rights and well-being of persons, peoples, and all of nature? So I'll stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Carolyn.
Hi, and thank you, Vanessa, tremendously. I'll start this one off and then hand it off to Roman. And so when I think about the rights in AI, I'm reminded of the concept of data mining. So when I think about data mining, I'm thinking about this phrase that evokes like the question of who has claim on the mining rights, who is being mined, who has a say. I also want to think about who is responsible for cleaning up the mess afterwards. So similar to mining, where there's tailings and things that aren't very useful, there are implications for AI, and I want to think about who's taking on the burdens of those. As we continue to wrestle with the impacts of colonialism, Indigenous scholars such as Margaret Yun Potu and others have described the risks and the need to resist a digital colonialism, which is collection without consent and no benefit to Indigenous communities. There's also the implication on water, for example, and in the use of fresh water in data centers and how that impacts communities, particularly those who already have limited to no access. For me, I'm also guided by Nan Weapahana's framework that asks, are we doing evaluation to, for, with, by, and as? And if we consider, are we doing evaluation with AI to, for, with, by, or as? So with clients, comes to ensuring that I'm considering asking who's making the decisions about what is collected and how it's used. Who's making decisions about whether we are using AI, on which data, in what ways. And then I want to be thinking about a larger scale, considering what assumptions and whose ways of analyzing are we embedding each time we run AI and we review the results. AI does not benefit everyone equally. And an AI access and retention of data ownership is impacted by intersectionality. There are also significant environmental impacts on water, particularly as data centers consume at least about a bottle of water per inquiry, although that number keeps shifting. So keep up to date on that. So I wanted to think about the impact on communities and how that question of does this actually benefit and who controls. So I'm going to hand it to Roman, who will share more on rights and OCAP as well.
Very much, Carolyn. And hi, everybody. Nice to see you all. Pleasure to be with you. I do think that there's a critical question here, and I think Carolyn, as you alluded to, kind of our opportunity to resist data colonialism as AI becomes, I saw somebody put in the chat, AI is inevitable. There's a lot of truth to that, and so that in itself makes it an ethical consideration. How do we resist data colonialism and uphold the rights and well-being of people as we participate in this inevitable but very new still to us technology? I think we can learn a lot from Indigenous ways of knowing when it comes to this question. And in particular, the principles of OCAP, which stands for ownership, control, access, and possession, is a really robust framework designed specifically by and for First Nations. I encourage everybody to take the excellent course offered by the First Nations Information Governance Center on OCAP principles. In our small group, we've made that mandatory for everybody. And there are two considerations that I would offer from this. Both have to do with the distributed model of artificial intelligence. Given that AI operates across distributed computers, any information given to it or generated by it, we relinquish control over. This implies a requirement of transparency and permission. Under the principles of OCAP, my client's data remains theirs to own and control. I only have temporary access to it. And this means I don't have actually the right to make a decision whether AI is a permissible tool, even if the data is de-identified. It's not my data. And so the decision must be made by the data owners, which includes individuals who are the sources of the data, communities, and nations. Permission must be properly granted. And so OCAP tells us what we must do when working with First Nations, and the CES Ethics Guide tells us that we ought to do this actually in all cases. So that's the permission principle. The second consideration is the distinction between do no harm, or don't curtail anyone's rights, and create benefit, or uphold well-being. The principles of OCAP are really explicit that we are to aim to create benefit for the owners of the information and their communities in all uses of it. So this points to the second principle of use, which is criticality and transparency. First, I have to critically consider whether using an AI tool, which would entail losing control over that data, right? Whether using that tool creates benefit for the owner and not just for myself. And second, then I have to communicate that hypothetical benefit as a part of seeking permission from the data owner. And so there are ways to think about this guided by OCAP principles. And then there are really practical things that you can take for in our practice. We're a small group of independent consultants. We have modified our contract language to get explicit about this, about data ownership and stewardship. And we've created end user licensing agreements to be really clear with our clients that we don't own their data. In cases where we are gathering data from community that they, the client, also don't own the data, the community does. And so there are ways to kind of bring this into practice and bring this into explicit conversation and control that that help us align both ethically and practically. Vanessa, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And just in the interest of time, we're going to move on to our second question for our panelists. I will ask Roman if you could put that OCAP course in the chat, that would be great when you have a moment. Ted, you know what? If you get a chance, if you want to post those AI blogs that you in the chat, I think people would also really appreciate that too, only when you have a chance. So let's go to our second question, which is how do you approach AI while seeking truth, honesty, and transparency? And Ted, I'll ask you to kick us off on this one.
Sure. Thanks, Vanessa. From our perspective, it's very much using good business practices. One of the things I really like about the new ethics code is the fact that it's very much values based. So decisions every time you use AI, it's typically for a different application, it's for a different client, different project, different type of data. And so you need to make sure that you have a strong AI policy, but it basically sets out values that you can follow in making the decisions around that. And so when we look at what some of the key elements are, from our perspective, the first one is disclosure, is making sure our clients understand that we're using it, how we're using it, where we're using it, and that we have permission to use it. I love Roman's idea of a data licensing agreement, not something that we had thought of before, but I think would be really interesting to kind of work into, even into our contracts that we have with clients. Second point is it needs to be human driven. My biggest concern about AI is that humans falling out of the loop. The humans need to be controlled in that process. If you're looking for credibility, for trust, for accuracy, we need to be involved in those steps. And you need to be really clear about defining kind of where you get involved, how you get involved, kind of at what stages, and kind of building, if you will, a series of gates around approving the process. You never lose ownership of the responsibility for what it's producing that carries over into your report. It's your opinion, it is your data, it is your representations that are carrying forward. Third thing around is data management. You're in control of what data the AI is using to make decisions. Don't let it decide kind of what the data sources are going to be. Don't let it start using Reddit, for example, right? Be very familiar with the data sources it's using, but really clear guardrails on it about what's allowable and what's not allowable. In the best case scenario, have a very clear set of documents or a data set that you control, that you're feeding into the system, and you don't let it use any other data beyond that. So I think that's critical. Very also critical is validation, being able to track it back. I mean, AI can help in terms of validating. It's kind of an unusual thing to use a different AI to check the AI that's coming out of one. Human expertise is absolutely critical. If there's anything I'm really worried about, it's people who are not very knowledgeable about a topic using AI to produce a report, because it doesn't make you knowledgeable, right? You need that human judgment kind of built into the loop. Having traceability, audit trails, I think, really important. A concept called red teaming, where you just try and break the system, if you will. You try and find a way to just verify, in fact, that what it's doing, what you think it's doing, is what it's actually doing. And then around bias and privacy, I think Roman spoke very, very nicely about some of the privacy issues. Being able to manage bias, being able to manage your own biases. We deal with that all the time in evaluation. AI can help in terms of doing it, but only if you're providing a very clear lens on that. And then, of course, human judgment is still critical. So I'll turn that back to you.
And I think it goes to Carolyn next, right?
Yes. All right. So thank you, Ted. I absolutely agree. Many of the points that you raised. And I think one of the things there is around the clear boundaries and what the data used. When we are thinking about seeking truth, again, it will go to the internet. And as we know, someone may be wrong on the internet. And so we want to make sure we're maybe putting parameters and telling it what the main source of information might be. So it might be the CES ethical guidelines when we ask about ethical considerations, for example. We also might be using two AIs to cross-check because they do have different strengths and weaknesses in there. And when they diverge, we often, as a human, get more curious there. I also want to make sure that final accuracy rests on us. It is, even though it's quick and easy to generate, quick and easy, and sometimes we have that time pressure, it is still on to us to go back and make sure it is coding where we think it's coding. It's pulling things in there. It's not changing quotes or voices. AI is really good at creation, but it's not yet great at wisdom, and it's not particularly good at ethics necessarily. And red teaming has shown that. And red teaming is where they basically put code, bots, things to try to break the chat GPT or equivalent AI system and try to make it do things that we didn't really want it to do. And they've been unfortunately very successful in breaking it, which tells us that the systems don't have a lot of safeguards in them. We also think about the impact on our own learning wisdom. As Ted mentioned, if we don't know the topic already, it can get a little bit nerve-wracking for us when we start getting into it. Because what it means is that I may think, okay, this seems quite convincing because generative AI came out of a programming that is trying to make you feel heard and make you feel like they're being helpful to you. As a result, it doesn't always proceed with accuracy. It tends to proceed with wanting to be helpful, although accuracy is indeed increasing over time. For transparency, I always like to take time to create a copy of the conversations I have. It used to be easier. You used to be able to export it. Now, if you try to export it, it doesn't. But you can share your conversation with team members, for example, and just be mindful of who has access to the original data you're uploading in with it. And then I sometimes just screenshot or otherwise PDF the content just so I have a copy of it. It's my equivalent of memos and qualitative analysis and syntax and quantitative. I also believe with AI that, as in life, clear consent is best. So practically, when I request permission, I discuss options. So with a client, I might say, okay, we can use de-identified data, we can test with public data, we can provide notice of use, we can do opt-outs. What would we like to do? I can also provide alternatives so that they don't feel pressure to use AI, and I need to give them enough time to consider so that they can meet again with clients, return to colleagues, think and reflect on those contexts to decide if the option makes sense. Because maybe they meet with an interest holder or a client later and realize, wait a second, I wouldn't want anything that we're talking about here to end up in AI. So maybe I want to be mindful of what's there. I also want to make sure, as mentioned earlier by Vanessa, that we do have a responsibility to give options for them that do save time, that are respectful of their budgets as well. And if AI can help in a good way, let's have that conversation. It's also very important to build our own AI literacy. And it was mentioned in the chat that this is an area that we can grow in as evaluators. And I think it's just something that we want to be able to better understand it so we can be more accurate and more appropriate and more ethical. So I'm going to hand it off to Roman next. Thank you.
It's actually back to Vanessa for question 3.
Okay.
Actually, Roman, now we can switch the order, but we had decided to go
yeah.
now. Yeah. So if you're ready, if not, we can have Ted speak first.
That's good.
Yeah. Okay.
That's good. Thanks. Sorry, I missed the switcheroo. I think there's a really important piece, Carolyn, that you mentioned, the difference between being accurate and wanting to please you. We have to understand, like Ted, you mentioned in your opening remarks, context is really critical and what the AI is trying to accomplish. And so in this process of seeking truth, we have to understand its goal isn't always to seek truth until we get into a relationship with it that helps it do that. So I think it's really critical to build your literacy, as Carolyn said, practice, assess, all right, assess its outputs, critique its outputs, and learn how to use the system. My own sense has been that using AI in a domain where I have deep expertise is a really healthy location to build my own AI literacy and fluency. So it's easier to spot its effectiveness and its drawbacks when I know the realm. And so I can build up my fluency there. In the beginning, Caroline talked about the 10% and 90% accuracy differential. That's a huge differential, right? So get yourself closer to the 90% by starting and remaining for a while in the realm of your expertise. So for example, say you have to write a theory of change or an evaluation framework as an evaluator, or as a consultant, you're drafting a proposal or a contract. Get the AI to generate you a draft. Learn how to prompt it to generate different kinds of drafts. Prompts matter, patience matters, and whatever you receive at the end, critique it first. Do it on your own, do it with other human peers, grade it, maybe make a rubric, right? Learn its limitations, do it several times, and you will build your own capacity by learning the tool's strengths and its challenges in your own context. In another example, let's say you have a lot of data to process and you want to feed it to the AI to generate insights and patterns. Don't. I think, at least not with generative AI, at scale, our capacity to determine the value of the proposed insights is going to be minimal. Either we already are able to have them, in which case we don't need the tool, or the scope is too broad. And until you have really deep literacy and fluency and probably expertise, I would say generation of insights and patterns is probably the riskiest space. But once you're comfortable knowing how to spot the tool's helpfulness versus its over-eagerness, then you can begin to kind of give it tasks at the edge of your capacity. So now it becomes really helpful and grows you out. Get it to recommend you maybe Excel formulas or Power Pivot step-by-steps. Get it to recommend you Python functions to process your data. It can do some research with citations again, right? So you can test, so you know whether it's coming from Reddit or a credible source. And then you're processing the results on your own, but you can still gain some of those efficiency gains. And now back to Vanessa.
Thank you. And actually now back to Ted.
Great.
I saw your hand up.
Thanks, Vanessa. So in terms of how you can get better at using AI ethically, the way that we look at it is we're at the intersection of being really good at what we do. We're knowledgeable about the topic, we're knowledgeable about evaluation, hopefully we're knowledgeable about the data. And we're mixing that in with an ability to use AI effectively. And so when we talk about using AI, that means that we're good at context engineering, we're good at prompting, we're good at data management in terms of the data that we're actually submitting to it or controlling it or directing it towards. And we're really good at kind of integrating that into our workflow. So whether it's as part of developing a work plan or developing a proposal or whatever, it's clear what it is. So in terms of getting good at that, the key things are, first of all, using it regularly. You don't learn other than really by getting your hands dirty with it. Secondly, is being good at selecting your use cases. So where are you going to use it? You want to use it on things that are pretty time consuming typically, things that are recurring that you're going to do again and again, but also things that you're knowledgeable about. And the next thing is really around having a knowledge of the data, having good data management, controlling the data that you're using, which I mentioned before, but also getting your hands dirty in the data. So for example, around the thematic analysis that Roman was talking about, we often run it 26 different ways, right? We'll ask it to provide a detailed list of the bullets, supporting each theme, or we'll ask it to, group together or link back to specific comments in the data set, or, looking at it so you really get your hands dirty. It doesn't remove your responsibility to understand the data on which you're running, and that I think is critically important. Other than that, it's really around kind of trying to keep current, and that can be incredibly frustrating because things are changing so quickly. I mean, even this summer when I started writing some of the blogs, it was GPT 5.0, and now it's 5.2, which is a lot different. And at the same time, Claude's making big advances. So we're investing in Claude for the first time. And so it's really around the challenges. It's difficult, but it's necessary. Vanessa?
Great. Thank you for that. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip us ahead to our third core value and discussion topic. So I'll ask now, how do you approach using AI while being responsible to all engaged in or affected by your evaluation work? And Carolyn, for one quick minute, can we go to you, then Roman, then back to you?
Yes. Yeah, we
Okay.
can do that for sure. All right. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate everyone coming, because one of the things you're doing today is taking that a step to keeping up to date. And I mean, that is something that happens regularly. So some of us kind of every 3 months, I go and check the analysis options, for example. But not everybody has that as a personal passion. And so it's an opportunity to listen to my colleagues like Roman and Ted and Vanessa as well, having these conversations and being here today. I wanted to also echo that just Ted's earlier comment on using repeated tasks And that's often where we might see the most cost on our own time and also on our clients. And we want to think about how we can help them and help us become a bit more efficient. But we also want to make sure we're doing it in the areas that we can tell when the AI is 10% accurate and the AI is 90% accurate. Because I've had, depending on the data set, both, because it depends on how well it fits with how the AI's brain works. So again, the more inference, the less accurate. The more variation in wording, the less accurate. So that's there. So I'll hand it over to Roman and then I'll come back and talk some more.
Carolyn, I think this is the most sort of deeply and directly ethical question. How are we going to be responsible to all engaged in or affected by our work? And I think that these kinds of deeply ethical questions can be supported by an understanding of a set of boundaries. And so I think that I want to offer 3 questions that we can each ask ourselves in any given context. Can I? May I? And ought I? And I think responsibility comes from being able to critically assess these questions and then transparently communicate my decision accordingly. So can I use AI is a question of capacity. Am I actually able to use it? And so building our own literacy, as we've talked about today, building our fluency with the tools, understanding their strengths and limitations, practical experimentation, seeking and finding limitations, both my own and the tools. This will give you confidence that you're acting within the boundaries of where you're capable. May I use AI is a question of permission. To be able to articulate your personal, organizational, and professional guardrails. What are the boundaries of permissibility? If there are no situations in which it wouldn't be permissible, perhaps you haven't done enough work yet. We have to be able to at least imagine some of those situations so that we know what the guardrails are, and then we can have confidence that we're not transgressing. And then should or ought I use AI is a question now of ethical analysis. If I can, and I may, now I get to engage in a critical analysis in each given situation to determine the benefits to all engaged in or affected by the work and the drawbacks or costs. And I should be able to articulate my ethical decision, preferably out loud, preferably to some of those affected by the work. And so ultimately, I think what questions you ask doesn't matter as much. These are 3 that work for me. But the act of slowing down enough to ask and engage critically with yourself and your peers and your community through your decision-making becomes a requirement in an age where these tools, with their deep opaqueness, are inserted into our workflows as the default. Responsibility means criticality and accountability for my decisions. I'll pass that back.
Thank you, Roman, for those 3 questions and the invitation to find our own questions. One of the things I'm reminded of is that when I teach interviews and I start the class to explain it, I have them introduce their peers. They've never met each other, perhaps. And I say, and afterwards we talk about what it means to take on the responsibility of telling someone else's story. And I think there's something really powerful in what we do as evaluators. We tell the stories of the programs, we tell the stories of the communities, we tell their strengths, perhaps their areas to improve. And I think if we're engaging in AI, we need to make sure, as mentioned, that AI is part of telling that story in a good way. And it's needing to make sure that AI is ensuring that it honors the voices that we're listening to. It ensures that the wording of the quotes isn't being misinterpreted or miscategorized or misrepresented. And we want to make sure we check in with those impacted because we want to make sure it reflects their stories as well. And at no point should anyone feel like this is done too. And I think that really is an important piece there. As somebody who has long geeked out on AI and the possibilities of it back to early 2000s, like 2000, 2001 was one of my first courses for in some of this. I really value what it can do, but I also value the risks of it. And I also value how important it is to return back to those relationships. At the end of the day, if using AI is a secret that you don't want to tell somebody, you probably don't want to be using it in the context of that relationship. So sometimes we think about, oh, I'll just use AI, nobody will know. I want to invite us to consider what does it mean about that relationship in terms of why I might not want to use AI in that space as well. That goes back to the question of ought I. The last thing I wanted to mention was that we need to be responsible how we treat other people's IP. Again and again, we're having interesting conversations about now that if you took this web panel, you could essentially have your own talking Ted, Carolyn, or Roman agent interacting with you, or reproduce a new video using AI. We want to make sure that copyright law, which has not kept pace with AI, still has its principles kind of respected. My voice is my voice. Hopefully no one else makes an AI video out of it. But I also want to make sure that whenever we are putting things in the public, we're very conscious that our reports, our voice, our writing style, our videos can all be consumed and replicated by AI. And we also want to be thinking about this when we're discussing public release with a client or anyone whose voices are included in that report. So just being mindful of what is not only consumed during our session, our time together when we're evaluating, but also as it goes out into the world. So thank you, and back to you, Vanessa.
Okay, wow, thank you all. That was a lot of really, really good food for thought, all in a whirlwind half hour. So that was impressive and amazing that we all stuck to the times, which leaves us time and a good period of time for questions for the next 25 minutes before we wrap up.